Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a subscriber ask a question, which I will flip in here for you guys. And you know what? This is one of those simpler questions, and I know I usually cover more complex topics than this. But you know, the thing is, there are a lot of people out there who maybe have only been looking into nutrition and stuff for a couple of months, a few months. They maybe have only read one book on it. They don't watch that much info, and they really don't kind of know the whole history of ketogenic diets or studies on fat loss or epidemiological studies on this stuff, and so they may not actually know the answer to this. So it's really, really good to cover this basic stuff again, particularly with the New Year's resolutioners coming in. There's going to be a lot of people coming in looking for basic advice, and this is a sort of fantastic question for those people. So for those of you who, have a pretty solid knowledge of nutritional science, obviously you may not want to stick around for this, but for the noobs, this is a perfect question. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, do a little bit of crafting, and let's talk about it. But yeah, he's like, basically, why do people tell you to cut out breads all the time? If you want to lose weight, why do people say cut out the bread or cut out the starches? That's always been a lot of it too. Interesting question, because that has been very popular for a very long time. Well, that's done for several reasons. Number one, due to the popularizing of ketogenic diets. All right. Also, the most common one known as the Atkins diet. But athletes have been experimenting with some of this for quick weight loss, and even some physique artists and bodybuilders were experimenting with these diets as far back as the 50s and 60s, right? This isn't anything new. And even athletes used to cut starches down to make weight for weight classes. So where does this come from? Because we know all the research shows that the lipid hypothesis, the insulin hypothesis, as far as insulin being responsible for fat loss, has been responsible for fat gain, has been thoroughly debunked by all the top nutritionists in the world. No one really buys into that other than a few book writers. So it's not accepted. We know from epidemiological studies that some of the cultures and peoples that eat the highest amount of starches and the highest carb diets oftentimes have the lowest body weight, oftentimes are the leanest. Oftentimes, they have the lowest rate of a lot of degenerative diseases like diabetes, heart disease, things like that. So, what's going on here? Where's this coming from outside of that? Where did people originally get this idea? You know what, guys? It's simple for a few reasons. There's some very simple reasons behind the reason it was popularized originally. Couple things. Number one, a lot of athletes notice that when they cut their starches back, the scale dropped a few pounds. And when they cut them to near zero, sometimes the scale will drop 4, 5, 6 pounds. And sometimes, as long as they kept their overall calories up, oftentimes they'd maintain weight. In fact, you guys have seen me do this before for powerlifting meets in the past, to where I go on zero carbohydrate diet starting about 8 or 9 days out from a meet, but stay on 4,000 calories a day, and use that with a water loading and depletion. I've dropped 18 pounds for meets in less than 2 weeks while maintaining strength and without using any diuretic type drugs to help aid with the water loss. But it's about water loss. That's what's going on there. When you cut starches back or carbohydrates back, you do get an initial water weight loss. Why? Because you lose hundreds of grams of stored glycogen in your body sometimes. Again, if you cut your carbohydrate intake back by 300 grams a day, if you've been eating 350 grams of carbohydrates every day, particularly if you've been fairly active, or even if you're obese and you just eat way too many carbs, you cut them back to 50 grams a day, that's 300 grams of glucose that you're taking in less a day. So you're going to store less glycogen. You lose several hundred grams of stored glycogen in your body. Every gram of glycogen attracts 4 grams of water, right? You drop water weight. You can drop several pounds within a matter of days, easily, even as a non-athletic person, by doing this, just because it takes off extra water weight. But a lot of it's intramuscular water, but some of it's intra-abdominal water as well. It's a good way to drop water weight quickly. All right. The other thing to note, in addition to something we're going to talk about with ketosis and appetite suppression, is that when you start removing major food groups, what some people do, just because their appetite gets reduced because there's whole sets of foods that they normally crave that they can't eat, they end up eating foods that they don't want to eat. foods that aren't appetizing to them that much at the moment, and they might seem like they are, but they really aren't, and then they eat less. So when you start chopping entire major food groups out, it cuts out the amount of foods that you have available. And with less variety available, people tend to, for a while, just eat less because their food is less palatable with less variety, less selection available to them. Okay? You've got that to factor in. Then you have another factor that a lot of people who are morbidly obese have a low insulin sensitivity. If you suffer from really low insulin sensitivity because you've been sedentary and obese, sometimes carbohydrates themselves will make you hungrier as a result of the way they spike your blood sugar and insulin levels back and forth. It can actually make you hungrier, and if your appetite goes up, guess what? You eat more, you get fatter. So then if you're doing less of that for a little while, you eat less, you lose weight more quickly. But the thing is, once insulin sensitivity is more normalized, once you've lost weight, you've started working out, exercising, then that benefit starts going away very, very quickly. Then there is the factor of ketosis itself. All right? There is the factor of ketosis itself. Well, ketosis occurs when your body is carbohydrate depleted, meaning when your body isn't getting enough glucose in, even in the form from even too much protein, when protein is kept moderate instead of ultra high protein, so you're getting your calories mostly from fat, your body eventually enters a state of ketosis. And what that does, it means that your body starts burning ketones for fuel instead of glucose at a much larger amount. It starts releasing ketone bodies into your bloodstream. All right, ketones can be appetite suppressing. Now, this is in part because they can cause a mild nausea, and that mild nausea that it can induce, so particularly sometimes when you start eating, particularly when sometimes someone eats a high-fat meal, they start eating a bunch of fat, they eat a plate of bacon or a bunch of eggs, it can spike their ketone levels, and then they experience just a little bit of nausea. They mistake that nausea for fullness, and then they eat less. So ketosis can be appetite reducing on its own. So it's this combination of things that have made people think that, hey, just not eating starches. And some people will say breads, but a lot of times they end up changing that over to starches in general. Is a form of weight loss, is an effective tool for fat loss. And it is, but by that same token, what we do know is that on a calorie for calorie basis, higher carbohydrate, lower fat diets actually cause more fat loss. So this is where we get into an interesting conundrum. And in fact, some people find higher carb diets, particularly if they're very fibrous carbs, to be more appetite suppressing. And also most people can be more athletic and active on a higher carb diet because they have a better fuel source available for higher intensity activities, such as more intense cardio, sports, weightlifting, things like that. But the thing is, we have found that when we normalize calories, there doesn't seem to be any advantage at all to the ketogenic diets, particularly once protein is equalized between the two, because there is a thermic effect of protein in a diet, but when that's normalized, people on higher carbohydrate diets actually tend to lose slightly more body fat on the same net amount of calories. So there's some interesting things going on there. So it's kind of this weird contradiction that happens. But again, people need to understand there are other factors involved. That for some people, the ketosis itself can be appetite suppressing enough to give them a fat loss advantage. And there's always that water weight factor going on. But ultimately, when we do studies, particularly long-term studies, people who follow diets for prolonged periods of time, people who follow more balanced diets, that are just very high on unrefined carbohydrate sources, a lot of whole grains, a lot of vegetables, even fruits to some extent. That again, if people are eating minimally processed, a lot of unrefined carbohydrates that are high in fiber, that actually those people in the long term on a more balanced diet like that tend to find total fat loss, not just weight loss, but fat loss tends to be a bit better for those people in the long term. But what we have noticed is that in the short term, a lot of morbidly obese people, particularly those who seem to be experiencing like metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance, will sometimes lose fat more quickly on a very low carbohydrate diet. But again, that's only in the short term, because if they're losing weight quickly, they're not going to be morbidly obese for long. And once they fall out of that morbidly obese category and they start exercising, that advantage does tend to go away over time. So it's kind of an interesting conundrum when you look at it. And so I would say to people, if you are sedentary and morbidly obese and you do have insulin sensitivity problems and blood sugar problems, yeah, a ketogenic diet might actually be a good idea. It's not just about just reducing bread, though. It's about going full ketogenic. But for people who are looking for something that's more sustainable in the long term and who are looking at their long-term fat loss, long-term energy levels, things like that, those people who aren't just looking for that short-term burst that they need, they're looking at the long term, they're probably going to find the exact opposite to be true, that eating a diet that's very high in starches, again, particularly unrefined carbs. I'm not talking about people eating a bunch of white flour and table sugar. I'm talking about whole grains, whether it's whole grain bread or oats or beans, fruit, watermelon, cantaloupes. Vegetables, everything from broccoli to squash. If you're getting most of your calories from foods like this, again, whole foods that are very high in carbs, and particularly even very, very high in starches, most people in the long term are going to find that to be a more sustainable method for losing fat and keeping that fat off, again, for prolonged periods of time. Because that sort of approach is a lot more balanced of a diet. It allows for better athleticism, better physical activity. It does give a better metabolic advantage over time because it tends to be better overall for body composition, which means muscle gain and fat loss, which is going to keep your metabolism the highest. And again, just better nutrient variety for overall health. Overall health in general is going to improve your energy levels. And if you're more energetic, you're going to find losing weight and keeping weight off easier. So people need to understand the difference. Ketogenic diets are generally a short-term fix for the morbidly obese who suffer from insulin resistance, and they're a great way to get a quick water weight loss when you need to make weight for some competitive endeavor. And used in some cases, they can be used by some people for photo shoots and things like that, but they have to be used very carefully for that because they can also make people look even worse than they did before also in some cases, depending upon how you approach it. So again, it's all about understanding where this comes from. It really is because people have noticed the short-term advantage from this. And I'm not saying that there aren't a few people who don't do better on ketogenic diets. There are people out there who do perform, even as athletes, very, very well on those sort of diets, but they are in the minority of people. And that's the thing that you need to keep in mind, that most people are generally going to do better in the long term by following a diet that's actually high in minimally refined carbohydrates. They don't have to be completely unrefined, but minimally refined. Basically, guys, not sitting around eating white flour and table sugar and high fructose corn syrup all day. Again, getting whole foods. If most of your calories are coming from starches in the form of whole foods, you're actually going to find your long-term fat loss goals to be easier. They're going to be easier to maintain for you over the course of a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. Again, when you're looking for long-term results. So hopefully that clarifies that and people kind of understand where that comes from now and what the idea is behind it and how it became popularized, but what the reality is of the situation. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.